During the first phase of quantum physics, that is roughly about the year 1900, when the word quantum was first used by Max Planck, to about the World War II, advent of World War II. That's what I call my first phase. There was a lot of excitement about worldview change that quantum physics is bringing on to Newtonian worldview, how continuity, determinism, these ideas and locality itself will have to give way to new ideas, discontinuity and indeterminacy and non-locality. And people are excited. Of course, then World War II intervened. The physics center of mass of physicists changed from Europe to America. And Americans are pragmatic people. The philosophy of pragmatism always has been dominant in this country. People who are less interested in philosophical questions, we became interested much more in applications, and here we are. Applications are much favored by acting on a philosophy that says matter is everything. Then one can just concentrate on matter, material goodies, material innovations, technology, and so forth. And of course, the Cold War didn't help this situation, because Cold War favors that weapons-based military-industrial complex development that scientific materialism was directly connected to. So this is the story of how it got that way, very, very briefly. Starting the 80s, there were alternative thinking, partly because of that experiment that I have talked to you already about, 1982, by Alan Aspect, who showed that non-locality is real. We have to deal with it. And then, of course, starting with 1989 with my paper on quantum measurement, Henry Stapp wrote a book, Mind, Matter, and Quantum Physics, and I wrote Self-Aware Universe. All that came out about 1993. Casey Blood wrote a beautiful paper and followed it up with a book in 2001. All these ideas were ideas that are radically new, ideas that are quite consonant with what the initial excitement was about, that the classical worldview will not only undergo change, but undergo radical change. Classical worldview has more than just those axioms, more than continuity, determinism, and locality and objectivity. Classical physics also has its major component, in fact all science, a major component. It is called material monism. Everything is matter. That philosophy is the fundamental tenet of scientific materialism. In the new view, that tenet itself, that fundamental tenet, started to be challenged. Now this is what we'll discuss now. So let's go back to that reductionistic picture that scientific materialism brings to us, that gives paradox of quantum measurement. That possibilities of elementary particles make possibilities for atoms, make possibilities for molecules, make possible cells, make possible brain, makes a possible consciousness in the form of an observer, and the observer looks at possibilities. How can that produce actuality if the observer himself or herself consists only of possibilities, only of matter? So therefore, the question arises, could observer's consciousness, this facility of knowing that the observer brings, that we can intuit, that must be extra, could that make a difference? Now, von Neumann, who first dealt with these questions very thoroughly, was convinced that quantum physics applies to the macro. Therefore, he was convinced that there is a paradox here which cannot possibly be resolved staying within supremacy of matter, within the primacy of matter, that everything is built of matter. Because then quantum possibilities will forever remain possibilities. There is no way, in view of von Neumann's mathematical theorem, material interactions can convert possibilities into actuality. No way. And therefore, von Neumann argued that there must be something non-material about the observer, And what else can it be but this facility of knowing that we call consciousness? So the idea is consciousness collapses quantum possibilities into actualities by choosing. This is the idea that von Neumann gave us. Unfortunately, in von Neumann's time, this is the picture that you could think of is a picture that is susceptible to a different criticism called dualism. How does a non-material consciousness interact with matter? How does a non-material consciousness interact with a material brain or a material elementary object, elementary particle? Because if there is nothing common between two things, they need a mediator to interact. Where is the mediator? A signal. That certainly will take energy from one object to the other. So energy should be lost from material world to this non-material world of consciousness, and that never happens. The energy of the material universe is always a constant. Therefore, dualism also gives us a paradox and must be rejected. People gave up thinking about consciousness, and there was even another paradox that could be asked, which I'll come back to later. But is there any other way of looking at this situation than scientific materialism, matter is everything, and dualism, that you have a dual world of consciousness interacting with the world of matter? Is there any third way of conceiving this situation? Yes, there is. And this third way has within it the seeds of what mystics often talk about. So this is our first hint that the new view would integrate science and spirituality. The way to think about consciousness, there is a third way to think about consciousness, other than it's the product of matter, other than it's not dual. The third way of thinking about consciousness is simply that consciousness is the ground of being, and everything, matter included, all objects are made of consciousness. Consciousness is the ground. If you think about it, immediately you would object. Why would you object? You would object because consciousness is so vague, so subtle. We know that we certainly have access to it. We are conscious. We have the facility to know. We know that. But it's nothing concrete. It's something, even although it is as close to us as the jugular vein, as the mystics sometimes would say, but it is still not concrete. We cannot say, for example, where is our consciousness? We cannot think of consciousness as an object, and rightly so, because it's not an object. It's something that transcends an object. In any case, it is difficult to think of concrete matter to be made of this very subtle consciousness. This is the first difficulty that people have. But remember, we are not talking about matter in its concrete form. This is the mistake we make. We are talking about possibilities of matter. What consciousness contains is material possibilities. Material possibilities can be made of consciousness. Possibilities are also equally subtle notion. This is where Casey Blood made a huge contribution. He wrote a paper in about 1993 where he made these points very, very, very cogently, very powerfully. He said that all the objects of quantum physics that we are dealing with, they are just mathematical functions, completely idealist things. They are not concrete things. They are abstract things. When consciousness interacts with these abstract things, or chooses, as von Neumann would say, from these possibilities the actual event, only then, through the interaction of consciousness with these subtle mathematical entities, do the concrete properties, solid, rigid, all those concrete properties appear. that we experience. They appear only momentarily in our experience, but they are not laid in concrete out there. This is the mistake that we make. They disappear as soon as we are not looking. Disappear where? Disappear in the same realm as the realm of potential, the realm of possibilities, that transcendent realm, that non-local realm. And this is the way to understand it. Notice that if consciousness is choosing from itself, if matter is made of consciousness, if consciousness is choosing from itself, then there is no dualism, no energy is needed, no mediator is needed. There is something common between the two. Consciousness is matter, they are not different, they are not separate in the sense that we are positing under dualism. Matter is part of consciousness. When we look at this way, then we realize that consciousness interacts with matter. Conscious choice happens through non-locality, signal-less communication. It's an example of non-locality. So if signal-less communications exist in the world, this is why our space experiment played such an important role in how people think. Because that experiment liberated us from this prejudice that every interaction, every communication must be associated with a local signal, a signal taking energy from one body to another. For the first time in human history, we could comprehend in a scientific way that two objects can communicate without exchanging local signals. Certainly consciousness can choose just by virtue of non-locality. If you're still having problem with this, there's a picture that I like to show very often, my favorite Gestalt picture. This is a picture where you see both one young woman and an old woman within the same lines. The artist called the picture My Wife and My Mother-in-Law. I hope you are having fun with the picture. If you are seeing the wife, just change the perspective of looking by moving your head a little bit this way, that way. But don't touch the picture. You don't have to. Just change the position of your head, position of the angle of your looking, and you will see the other meaning without doing anything to the picture. Why don't you need to do anything to the picture? For the very simple reason that the two meanings exist within you. You are giving meaning to the lines. The lines don't have any inherent meaning. It's just a picture drawn by an artist. You are giving meaning to it, and those meanings are already within you, and you don't need to do anything to the picture in order to conceive one meaning, perceive one meaning or the other. Consciousness chooses one actuality vis-a-vis another exactly by this, depending on the perspective, depending on the perspective of the choice. You see how fantastic, how revolutionary this kind of thinking is. In the olden days, when Heisenberg and Bohr and others were debating incessantly the implication, worldview implication of quantum physics, they used to talk about free will in connection with uncertainty principle. If we cannot determine trajectory of objects, then there is indeterminacy in the world, and that makes room for free will. That's all they could talk about. There is a room for free will. But they could not pinpoint where the free will is or how the free will is exerted. Today we can do that. We can for the first time lay it out, right for you to see that free will works because consciousness can choose freely even the complete new actuality that has never been chosen before. Creativity, freedom, all these things now make an appearance. Goodbye determinism forever. It's no longer a fancy to say no longer it's just a presumption to say that, well, there must be room for free will. There is free will. There is free will. But of course, if you have observed your own difficulties of freedom, then you also know that we have to all agree to some extent with behavioral psychologists who don't see any free will at all, who only see conditioned actions in most of human endeavors, and who will be right in claiming that way. So you wonder, where is that free will exerted from? This is a very important question. Some of you will remember that in the 1970s, when these these ideas were floated, von Neumann's idea was popularized during that time in the 70s. Fred Alan Wolf, a very famous quantum physicist, suggested the very famous sentence, "We create our own reality." So how did people try to create their own reality? What did they decide to choose? They decided to choose Cadillacs for themselves. Cadillac was the most popular car in the 1970s. So people had chants, I remember, "Oh God, give me a Cadillac," something like that. But it never happened. Then people started to try to visualize parking spaces for their cars in busy downtown areas. That would be something. But even that didn't work too well. So gradually that movement went. But the movement came back again in the form of The Secret. So something in the human being knows that this is not entirely fanciful. But still the question intrigues us. Why can't we just wish? If consciousness chooses, why can't we just wish and manifest anything that we like? We are perturbed that we can't. So what is the catch? Eugene Bigner, about the year of 1960, I think it exactly was published in 62 or something like that, but he had conceived a paradox that will clarify the situation. His paradox was, suppose there are two people choosing at the same time. Okay? To conceive of this, imagine that we have a traffic light with a two-valuedness, red and green. For the moment, we'll omit the yellow, just red and green. And you are approaching this traffic light. This is a quantum traffic light. You can imagine that radioactive decay is connected with the traffic light and helps the traffic light to change. So in that way, quantum traffic light is easy to conceive because radioactive process is a quantum process. All right, so you are approaching the traffic light from one direction and your friend is approaching it from the perpendicular direction. And then who gets to choose which way the light will go? Now, being busy Americans, both of you will choose green, of course. What else? But then pandemonium, right? Especially if you are driving by car, pandemonium, certainly. So who gets to choose? There obviously is only one choice allowed. Who gets to choose? If you say, I get to choose because I am I and my friend is just my imagination, at least that's the way I perceive my friend, and it is true, philosophically speaking, it certainly is true. This is called the philosophy of solipsism. A little bit like that Bette Midler joke that she used to tell. A Hollywood woman meets a friend on the street, gets very excited. She hasn't seen this friend for 30 years. Let's go to a coffee house and catch up with each other, she says. So they go to a coffee house and sit down with a cup of coffee, and she starts talking and talking and talking. After about half an hour, she becomes aware that she is talking all this time. So she says, oh, look at me, I'm talking about myself all this time. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? So this is the world of solipsism, where you only exist and your friend is important only because she or he is your friend. Otherwise, just a figment of your imagination. In that world, this paradox, called the paradox of beginner's friend, can be solved. Because in that world, there's only you. But in the real world, of course, your friends think the same way. Everybody thinks the same way, but everybody is quite legitimate in their own right, as you know. So it's just a matter of shifting the paradox from who gets to choose to who gets to the head honcho. Does not really help in resolving the paradox. Paradox remains. Is there any way of resolving the paradox? Of course there is. If you think of consciousness as the ground of being, is there any separateness between people? Ultimately, they are all connected. We are all connected by this ground. You and your friend are connected by this non-local consciousness. So the answer is that it's not neither you nor him or her that is choosing. Who chooses? The consciousness that is beyond both of you, that connects both of you, that non-local consciousness, that interconnectivity, that non-local field, that non-local medium, any which way you can think of it. That is choosing. Again, we are forced to look at mysticism a little more seriously. Mystics talk like that we are all connected. Poets talk like that. Novelists talk like that. They have the image like we are all connected, like we are islands on the face of it from the surface, but if we look underneath, there is a bedrock connecting us. This kind of analogy comes to mind. We are connected. And this connectedness is our consciousness. That is the ground of being. This is why it's called the ground of being, the ground that all of us are connected to. And that's where the choice is coming from. This is why I'm not in my ego even aware that I make the choice. Because I, where I'm separate, am not making the choice there. When I make the choice, like what flavor of ice cream would you like, and very aware that I'm making the choice, on second thought, I realize that the behaviorist is right. I'm just choosing between two already conditioned patterns of habit. That's the choice we have. Ego's choice is very limited. Not to be completely disregarded, it's still very important. You'll realize that when somebody else tells you to choose all the time, like parents sometimes do to their children. Don't you remember the song, I get tired of hearing everybody telling me what to do? Nobody likes that. So this choice, ego's choice, is also very important. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not really that important. What is ultimately important is complete freedom to choose. Freedom to choose even the new that never have been manifested before. What we call creativity. We can use free will to be creative. To be creative, to make creative products, like all the beautiful things that have come to us, motor cars, light bulbs, theories, creativity. What also has come to us is the idea that we can change. We don't like some of what we do, right? Everybody has these qualms about themselves. We want to be the perfected being. The idea of creativity and freedom to choose gives us the idea that we can change. We can change some of the habits that we don't like. This idea of transformation is very important to the human being. So in this way, quantum physics brings us back what we fundamentally care about. We don't care about a deterministic world. We don't care about how everything would be predictable and controllable. We don't care about control that much. How many times have you become tired of a person that you regularly interact with because he or she is too predictable? We like just the right mixture of predictability and non-predictability, predictability and creativity. Creativity and conditioning both. Without some conditioning, we would not have any reference point. You would not be you and I would not be me. But if we are totally conditioned, can you imagine such a world? That is not the world we live, fortunately. The world we live is a mixture of creativity and conditioning. Both why? Because we have this collective, interconnected, non-local consciousness from which creativity comes. And then we have this conditioned ego from which determined behavior comes. But don't think of them as two separate beings. They're not. Conditioning is just a imposition on the freedom of consciousness, a limitation that comes from stimuli and learning responses to stimuli. Learning produces this conditioning, produces this deviation from quantum behavior. In this way, we get the ego. So these things can now be talked about within a worldview where consciousness is primary. But let's go back to something that I spoke in the last lecture. Scientific materialism, that matter is everything, excludes a lot of stuff. It's an exclusive philosophy. Excludes mind, excludes meaning, excludes values, excludes feeling, because feeling cannot be computed. It includes only those things that machines can do, that can be computed. So part of mind, that computable part of mind can be included. But then there is also the creative mind, the free-willing mind, that cannot be included. Intuition cannot be included because intuition is completely unpredictable and non-computable. Feelings cannot be included because feelings are likewise non-computable. You remember, if you watch Star Trek, the incessant debate that characters of Star Trek would have about reason versus emotions. But emotions do define humans. Human beings are emotional. That's important to being human. What's the problem of the machine theorist, mechanical worldview? Problem is that emotions cannot be predicted, so cannot be controlled, cannot be computed. You cannot have an emotion chip. So in this way, the scientific materialism philosophy has excluded a lot of stuff, and because it has excluded so much, we have become so narrowly defined that today much of our freedom has been constricted, have been compromised. Because we ourselves have accepted, like Richard Feynman once was giving a lecture to a whole bunch of scientists, and you know what he said? He said, well, if you want to be a scientist, you've got to put in this straitjacket called scientific materialism. You've got to do it. There is no other way of becoming a scientist. Scientific materialism. Matter is everything. This was the belief that people had in the last century. And in later half, this is the reason that we went downhill. Okay, we made some progress during the 60s and 70s, but very quickly we started going downhill. We did not do very well in the later half of 20th century in terms of freedom, in terms of real creativity, real innovations. All the ideas that we play with today are based on ideas that were developed in the 1950s. Nothing much new in all these decades. And why is that? Today everybody talks about lack of innovation in our culture. Why is that? Because we have forgotten this other half, the half where possibilities reside, where I do have the choice to choose anything from the possibilities and bring new stuff. Instead, what we have believed in is that this is nature, this is all there is, the material world moving in space-time, and we have limited ourselves. Dogma of scientific materialism, exclusive dogma. It is no better than the dogma that prevailed before modern science came along. You have to go back 400 years to imagine that world, how tyrannical that world is. You have read stories about how people were burned at stake because of their beliefs, and that is true. Today, at least, that doesn't happen. We have become enough civilized. But still, we have dogma fighting dogma. In America today, everybody knows that there are two political parties and there is a great divide between them. What has happened? What has happened is a deep polarization. One political party, namely Republicans, still hold on to that old, archaic dogma of Christianity. Everything is like the Bible says. Well, most of them pretend anyway. I don't think educated Republicans could possibly believe everything comes from the Bible, because they go through this education of stuff that came after the Bible, and much of which is based on experimental data. Like the earth is not 6,000 years old, it's has been around for at least 5 billion years, something like that. And life has been around for 4 billion years, something like that. So these things, I don't think anybody in their right mind would care to not believe. But nevertheless, a large number of people pretend that the biblical truth is the way to discern between truth and falsehood. On the other hand, the other half, the Democrats, they believe strongly in science. And they, on the other hand, also believe in this dogma that everything is matter. So they undervalue values. They don't have much faith in values. Now, of course, Christianity is to blame for some of it, because remember, in popular Christianity, the values are defined in a very funny way. Yes, the values are heavenly, they come from God. That part is very nice. But then they say that God wants us to follow values. Why? Because otherwise we will be punished. And this is the problem. This idea of being punished when the moment of truth comes, the moment of judgment, this we don't like. We are too used to democracy, we are too used to freedom, although freedom doesn't exist in the deterministic world of scientific materialism either, but we forget that momentarily. We don't like to be told by God that I have not followed value and therefore I have to go to hell. This idea we don't like. We can live in a valueless world where material interactions are deciding what we do anyway. That we don't mind. But you see how our worldview influences in how we do things, how we believe, and so forth. So we have this polarization. One side believes values, something very valuable indeed. And the other side believes science, again, something very valuable indeed. If we don't have science, we are giving up on a wonderful way to tell the truth, because science has those two prongs, theory and experiment. One can theorize, but unless one verifies, the theory is just a theory. At the same token, Republicans have values on their side. How can you live without values? Truth itself. How do you know that one should be truthful? How do you know that science has any value? Because science is based on truth. Truth value is what we are judging by subjecting theories to experimental data. If truth was not important, why is the need for experiment? Anything goes. This is, of course, why Fox News gives out as truth something like there is no global climate change. Or one of our presidents said something like trees pollute. Because in that world where there is no fact is fact, anything goes. If you start believing that science isn't right, then anything goes. But if you start believing that values are not there, then science itself is undermined, because there is no value to truth. Truth itself is a value. That's all it is. It's one of the archetypes that Plato defined that forms the basis of civilized thinking. Truth, beauty, justice, love, and goodness. See, if you give up these things, what is civilization? Civilization itself is undermined. And this is what we are seeing today. Civilization is being undermined. When I say we are going downhill. This is what I mean. We are going downhill in terms of being civilized people anymore. We cannot even be civil to each other. So quantum worldview has much to contribute, much to contribute. Quantum paradoxes, the resolution of which demands that consciousness defines the philosophical basis of our worldview, is very important. Why? Is very important because in this worldview, we can truly define a dogma-free science. Can science ever be dogma-free? Can any system ever be dogma-free? Yes, it can. How? How is to introduce everything in the science that is the case. Abraham Maslow says science must deal with everything that is the case. We can do that now. How? Because the idea is this idea that matter exists as possibilities within a ground of being that is consciousness is so tremendous, so easily subjected to one generalization that we need to do. And then you will see how we can include everything that is the case in the new science. Carl Jung, a great psychologist in the last century also, studied a lot of people and found that people have 4 kinds of personality traits. Some people are very oriented towards physical sensing. But there are other people who are equally oriented to feelings. Their personality is based on feeling. That's how they gauge truth value of something. They feel. And then there are thinking people. And finally, Carl Jung found that a small class of people could be called intuitive people. They value intuition the most in terms of forming their personality. 4 personality traits. Now suppose we say that there are 4 different universes of possibility. One is the physical. If we choose a physical possibility to become actuality, the experience we have is a physical experience of sensing. Then we have this world of vital energies. If we choose from that world a possibility that becomes actuality, that experience we feel. Feeling is that experience. Same way with mind. Mind processes meaning. So in this all possible meanings, if we choose from that, we have a thought. Thoughts are always about meaning. And then we have the intuitive world, which Sri Aurobindo called supramental, beyond the mind. Plato called archetypal, the world of archetypes. Truth, beauty, justice, goodness, abundance, all that good stuff. If we choose from that world, then we get the experience of intuition. 4 different worlds, 4 different kinds of possible world, 4 different choices, 4 different experiences. And guess what? Now you have included everything that is the case. Everything that is the case. Because there is nothing outside of what we consciously experience. This is a simple thing to recognize. This is just common sense. The world exists because what we experience is the world. There is no world, obviously, that we have not the possibility of experiencing. Only, how do we know that a world exists? Only because we experience something sooner or later. For example, we can say that the unmanifest in the quantum way of looking at things, there are, of course, unmanifest possibilities. But how do we know that unmanifest possibilities exist? We know that because eventually unmanifest becomes manifest. That's what we call creativity. And therefore we know that the unmanifest exists, because something new happens every once in a while to us. How do we know that something is unconscious? The same way. Because eventually the unconscious becomes conscious. Or every now and then there is an effect of the unconscious and we become conscious of it. That's how we know that there is there are processing going on in the unconscious that affects what we experience in our consciousness. So there is nothing in the world, nothing in reality that is outside of our eventual experience. So by looking at our experience, if we define the world properly, then we are taking into account everything that is the case. Now, it is possible that we have not experienced something as of yet because we don't have the apparatus in our body, mind, brain, the ability to experience that yet. That is possible. Certainly, it's not ruled out. But everything that is the case, this is why Abraham Maslow defines it very carefully. Everything that is the case is already included. Of course, there could be things which are not the case yet because we don't have the apparatus to experience those things as of yet. That's not ruled out. But that's for the future. At this stage of our evolution, whichever is the case, we now can include in our new science by making this huge assertion. Consciousness is the ground of being in which there are 4 different worlds or compartments. World of matter, which we sense, world of vital energies that we feel, world of the mind or meaning that we think, and the world of archetypes or values that we intuit. This is the basis of a whole new science which can explain all paradoxes, which can explain all the anomalous data that has been collecting for quite a while in all the different fields of human endeavor. And this is what one after the other will study in this entire courses. This particular, the first one is just an introduction. But then you will have gradually an exposition to all these different problems and their solutions and how to live these solutions, how to build technologies on these solutions, how to build civilization once again on the basis of this new worldview.